Hello, welcome. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the dark corners of history, please check if you're following the show and share your favorite episode with a friend. It tells the algorithm that we make great content. Thank you. Every empire you've ever heard of died the same way. Not for the same reasons exactly, but in the same order, the same sequence, every time, running at wildly different speeds. Rome took 2.5 centuries to fall, and one French company did the whole thing in 18 months. There are 7 stages. That's the strange part. 7. And once you can see them, I'll warn you now, you can't stop seeing them. Now, I want to be careful here. This isn't a law of physics. It's not a theory I can prove to you in a laboratory. It's a pattern, a shape I've come to see, looking at enough of these from the outside. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just noticing. There's a difference, and it matters. Here's what makes it eerie, though. The stage that feels like triumph, the golden moment, the peak everyone remembers, is almost always the exact moment the empire starts to die. The moment an empire looked strongest to the outside world was, nearly every time, the moment the rot set in on the inside. We're going to watch it happen 10 times, and by the end, you'll be able to look at any power on Earth and know exactly where it stands, including, quietly, the one you're living in right now. But let's start at the end. Let's watch how an empire dies, and notice how little it looks like dying. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. We are close towards a milestone for this little channel. 500 followers. It is not much, I know, but it is progress, and I cannot get there without your help. So if you have enjoyed one of my episodes, share it with a friend who would too, and follow if you have not. It matters more than it should. Thank you. Ravenna. Late summer, the year 476. It's not a burning skyline. There's no last stand, no screaming crowd, no fire on the walls. It's a quiet room. A Germanic general named Odoacer stands in it, and across from him is a boy. A teenager, really. An emperor with a borrowed name far too big for him, Romulus Augustulus. Little Augustus, named absurdly after both the founder of the city and the founder of the empire, as if the weight of those two names could hold up a thing that had already stopped standing. And here is the strange part. The boy is not killed. He's retired, pensioned off, sent south to a comfortable villa in Campania to live out his days in the sunshine. The imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the symbols of 1,000 years of Roman power, is quietly bundled up and shipped east to Constantinople with a message that amounts to this: The West doesn't need an emperor anymore. Keep these. We're finished with them. That's it. That's the moment. This is what the whole world remembers as the fall of Rome, the single most famous ending in human history. The event we've been talking about for 1500 years. And in its own time, it was barely news. No historian rushed to record it. No great chronicler marked the day the empire of Caesar and Augustus and Trajan came to an end because, and this is the thing I need you to sit with, from the inside, almost nothing changed. There was so little left to lose that losing the last of it hardly registered. The mightiest machine the ancient world ever built didn't end with a scream. It ended with a shrug, a signature. A boy handed a pension. And I want you to hold on to a question without me answering it yet. How? How does something that enormous, that dominant, that certain of itself, arrive at a moment this small? And why? This is what haunts me. Why does every empire, in the end, seem to find its way to the same end? We'll come back to this, I promise you. And when we do, it will look completely different the second time. To understand that room in Ravenna, we can't start with an empire. Not yet. We have to start with something smaller and faster and far more modern. A single man who built an empire out of paper and lost it before a single season could turn. Because he shows you the whole shape at a speed you can actually watch. His name was John Law, a Scotsman, a gambler, first, a genuinely gifted one, the kind who understood probability decades before probability was a respectable thing to understand. He'd killed a man in a duel in London, fled to the continent, and spent years drifting through the gambling houses of Europe, turning card tables into a living and, quietly, turning a theory over in his mind. A theory about money. Here's the thing about early 18th century France. It was broke. Ruinously, catastrophically broke. The old Sun King, Louis XIV, had spent 70 years building palaces and fighting wars. And when he finally died, he left behind a state so buried in debt that the interest alone was eating the kingdom alive. And into that wreckage walked John Law, with an idea that sounded, to a desperate government, very much like magic. His idea was this. What if money didn't have to be gold? What if a nation could print paper? Paper backed not by metal in a vault, but by trade, by land, by the sheer productive promise of an empire, and use that paper to jolt a dead economy back to life. It was a genuinely brilliant idea. In fact, it's more or less how every modern economy works today. Law was simply 300 years early. And being right too early, as we'll see again and again in this collection, is its own kind of fatal. He had one thing that mattered more than the theory. He had a patron, a friend at the very top, Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, who was ruling France as regent, while the real king was still a child. And a powerful friend at the beginning is how almost every one of these stories starts. A small group, a desperate situation, One clever solution nobody else could see. The people at the top, still sharing the risk together, still hungry, still improvising. In 1716, Law opened the Banque Générale, a bank that issued paper notes. It worked. The notes held their value, trade began to breathe again. So the regent let him go further. In 1717 came the Compagnie d'Occident, a company handed exclusive rights to develop France's vast Louisiana territory in the New World. And here is where the improvisation began, quietly, to harden into a machine. Because Law didn't stop at one company. Over the next 2 years, he swallowed France whole. The Compagnie d'Occident absorbed the other trading companies until, by 1719, it was the Compagnie des Indes, a total monopoly over all of France's colonial trade. Then Law took over the collection of the nation's taxes. Then the Royal Mint, the right to strike France's coins. Then the central bank itself. Do you see what's happening? One man, one foreigner, simultaneously running France's currency, its bank, its taxes, its mint, and its entire overseas trading empire, all fused into a single structure, with no wall anywhere between them. It may be the most concentrated peacetime economic power ever placed in one private pair of hands. And within 3 years, this one Scotsman controlled more of France than any Frenchman alive. But watch what fusion does. When there's no separation between the bank and the currency and the taxes and the trading company, a crack in any one of them isn't contained. It runs through all of them at once. Law had built something that could only ever stand perfectly or fall completely. There was no middle setting. For a while, it stood perfectly, more than perfectly. The shares of the Compagnie des Indes began to rise, and then they began to soar. People could see the numbers climbing, and so they bought, and their buying pushed the numbers higher still, and that pulled in more buyers. A self-feeding spiral of pure belief. In a single year, from January to December of 1719, the share price went from around 500 livres to around 10,000, a rise of roughly 1900% in 12 months. France went mad for it. A narrow Paris street called the Rue Quincampoix, where the shares changed hands, became the beating heart of the frenzy. So packed with speculators from dawn to dark that, as the story goes, a hunchbacked man made a small fortune simply renting out his back as a writing desk so buyers could sign their contracts on his spine. I'll let you decide how literally to take that one, but it tells you the temperature of the thing. And ordinary people, servants, shopkeepers, coachmen, were becoming rich beyond anything their world had a category for. So rich, in fact, that the language itself had no word for them. And so, a word was invented right here in this exact episode to describe them. The word was millionaire. It had to be coined because the amount of sudden wealth had genuinely never existed before, and there was nothing to call the people who had it. Pause on that. A word we still use every single day, was born out of a bubble. The dictionary had to expand because reality had briefly, gloriously come unmoored from it. Everyone could see the numbers going up. What almost no one wanted to ask was what exactly was underneath them. And the answer was not much. Because Louisiana, the actual colony, the actual source of all this supposed wealth, was mostly swamp and struggle and disappointment. It was not producing profits at anything remotely like the scale the share price implied. The paper had detached from the ground entirely. It had become pure faith. And to keep faith fed, Law did the only thing his fused machine allowed him to do. He printed more money, more paper, to buy more shares, to keep the number climbing. That works. Right up until someone looks down, and eventually, the largest, calmest, cleverest holders did look down. They began, very quietly, to convert their paper back into gold and silver. Real metal. And once, a few of the smart ones started quietly moving their wealth out of the system. Well, there's your warning, isn't it? When the people who understand it best begin slipping toward the exits, before anyone has said a word out loud. The run began. Everyone reached for their gold at once, and there was nowhere near enough gold. The shares that had touched 10,000 livres fell to 2,000 by September of 1720, and to 1,000 by December. Roughly a 90% collapse in 3 months. The giddy climb and the sickening drop turned out to be the same motion, just run in reverse. John Law was dismissed from every office in May of 1720. By December, he had fled France entirely, a hunted man. He died in Venice in 1729, poor. The man who had, less than a decade earlier, personally controlled the wealth of a great kingdom. And France's public credit was so scarred by the whole affair that the damage echoed for generations, feeding a deep national distrust of banks and paper money that lingered long after Law himself was forgotten. He compressed into 18 months what most empires take centuries to do: rise, peak, rot, run, collapse, the entire arc, at a speed you can hold in a single glance. Which raises a rather unsettling question. If you can watch the whole thing happen in a year, what does it look like when you take that exact same mistake and slow it down to a crawl? Law's empire was paper, and it lasted a year. The next one was paper too, but it lasted 2 centuries. And it made very nearly the same bet, so slowly and so grandly that almost no one noticed it was the same bet at all. In 1602, the Dutch chartered something the world had never seen before, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, known ever after by 3 letters. The VOC. On paper, it was a trading company. In reality, it was something stranger and larger than that. Because the Dutch government did not just grant it a monopoly on trade with Asia, it granted it sovereign powers. Let me be precise about what that means, because it's a strange thing to sit with. This private company, this thing owned by shareholders, This thing, whose entire purpose was to make a profit, was given the legal right to wage war, to sign treaties with foreign kings, to mint its own coins, and to build forts and govern colonies on the far side of the world. A corporation with an army. A corporation with a navy larger than many nations possessed. A corporation that could, entirely lawfully, declare war on a sovereign state. And it did. It built an empire across the Indian Ocean and the Indonesian archipelago that was, by any honest measure, bigger than most kingdoms in Europe. For 100 years it paid out staggering dividends, averaging something close to 18% a year, year after year, decade after decade. It was the first company in history to sell its shares to the public, the ancestor of every stock market that has ever existed, and it made its shareholders rich for longer than most empires even last. Now, you'll sometimes hear it called the most valuable company that has ever existed. Worth, the internet loves to say, some $7.9 trillion in modern money. I'll be honest with you, that figure is almost certainly nonsense. Economic historians have pulled it apart. The sober, gold-adjusted estimates come out several orders of magnitude smaller. So let's not lean on it. We don't need to. A private company that fielded its own army, ran its own navy, minted its own money, and paid its owners 18% a year for the better part of 200 years. That is astonishing enough, without inventing a number for it. For 100 years, it looked utterly unstoppable. But, and here is the whole story in a single word, looked. By the end, looking unstoppable had quietly become the entire business model. And that is a very different thing from being unstoppable. Here's how the rot began. And it began, as it so often does, at the very top, with the men who ran the thing. The VOC was governed by a board known as the Council of 17. And over time, the men who staffed the company, its officers, its captains, its colonial administrators, developed a comfortable habit of enriching themselves on the side, private trading, on company routes, kickbacks, quiet self-dealing. Now, most institutions catching this would try to stamp it out. The Council of 17 did something far more revealing. They redefined corruption. They quietly adjusted the rules so that the self-dealing their own officers were doing became technically permitted. They didn't fix the problem. They legalized it. The Dutch, looking back, gave the company's whole long decline a phrase. Vergaan onder corruptie. Perished under corruption. The people running the company had stopped serving the company. They were serving themselves, with the paperwork carefully rewritten to make it respectable. And then came the arithmetic, the quiet, patient, devastating arithmetic. From around 1730 onward, the VOC began paying out more in dividends than it was actually earning in profit. That one's worth sitting with, because it's the heart of the matter. The richest company on earth was handing its shareholders returns it had not, in fact, made. To do that, to keep the checks flowing, to keep the appearance of health perfectly intact, it began to eat itself, selling off its own trading capital and taking secret loans from the Bank of Amsterdam to plug the gap. This went on for roughly 70 years. 70 years of a company faking its own vitality, borrowing in the shadows to pay dividends it hadn't earned, so that from the outside it would keep looking exactly like the golden thing it had once genuinely been. And here is the detail I want you to hold, because it is the purest, coldest proof of everything this collection is about. Right in the middle of this, as the internal rot was already well underway, the company's share price on the market climbed to around 1,200% of its original value. The market was paying record prices near the very top for a company that was, on purpose, already quietly insolvent. The moment it looked most valuable to the outside world was a moment when, on the inside, the decay was decades along. The numbers still worked on paper. The cash just wasn't there. And the VOC may be the clearest example of that particular sickness in all of history. For 70 years, the richest company on earth was faking its own health, and the market kept buying. You cannot borrow in the dark forever, though. The shock, when it came from outside, as it almost always does. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, from 1780 to 1784, saw the British Navy capture more than 50 VOC ships and choke its trade routes. The losses were immediate and irreversible. And worse than the ships was what the crisis exposed: those secret loans dragged into the light. And when they were revealed, confidence didn't just collapse in the company. It shook the Bank of Amsterdam itself, the very institution that had quietly propped the whole illusion up. The end, when it finally arrived, had no drama in it at all. No last battle, no burning fleet. The company's charter simply came up for renewal on the 31st of December, 1799, and the Dutch state chose not to renew it. It let the contract lapse. The greatest corporation the world had ever built, a private empire 2 centuries old, ended not with a bang, but with an expired piece of paper and a mountain of debt handed off to the government. It's the same bet John Law made: value floating free of anything real, propped up by belief and borrowing. He just ran it in 18 months, outlawed in a frenzy. The VOC ran it for 70 years, in silence, in the account books, in perfect corporate calm. Same mistake, wildly different clock. But strip away even the balance sheet. Strip away the ships and the shares and the dividends entirely. Does the pattern still hold for something that wasn't a company at all? Something that wasn't even really in the business of money? It does, as an order of warrior monks who believed they answered to no one on earth but God, were about to discover in a single morning. Before we go on, if you're finding this pattern as quietly unsettling as I do, stay with me, Because the next 3 stories are where it stops being about money and starts being about people who were absolutely certain they were untouchable. We're just getting to the good part. They began with 9 men, 9 nights on the dusty roads to Jerusalem in the year 1119. Their job was humble almost to the point of absurdity: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land from bandits. That was it. A small, poor, dangerous, deeply serious brotherhood. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ, they called themselves, who took vows of poverty and swore to guard the roads. The hungry founding in its purest form. A tiny group sharing every risk, solving a problem no one else had solved. And then something happened that happens to nearly all of them. They discovered they were good at it. And that being good at it opened doors to far more than they had ever set out to take. In 1139, the Pope himself, in a bull called Omne Datum Optimum, placed the Knights Templar under his direct and personal protection. The consequences of that document are hard to overstate. From that moment, the Templars answered to no king, no bishop, no local lord. They were exempt from taxes, exempt from local law, free to cross any border. Answerable to one man only, and that man was the Pope, far away in Rome. They had become, in effect, a sovereign power that owned no country, a state made entirely of men and money and faith, floating above the ordinary map of who owes what to whom. And what they did with that freedom was invent modern banking. Think about the problem a pilgrim faced. To travel from London to Jerusalem carrying gold was to invite robbery and murder at every mile. So the Templars built something ingenious. A pilgrim could deposit his gold at the temple in London and receive a letter, an encoded note of credit. He'd carry only the paper. And at the end of his journey, at a Templar house in the Holy Land, he'd present that letter and withdraw his funds. Deposit here, withdraw there, with nothing valuable on your body in between. They had invented the letter of credit, the direct ancestor of the traveler's check, of the wire transfer, of the entire idea that money can travel as information instead of as metal. To do this, they built a network of fortified houses, preceptories, spread, as the chroniclers put it, from the Atlantic to the River Jordan. You'll sometimes hear a figure of 9,000 Templar properties. I'd treat that as one medieval writer's estimate rather than a hard count. But the shape of it is true. A web of vaults and safe houses stretching across the whole of the known Christian world, all under one command, all outside any king's reach. And that made them the safest bank in existence. So safe that they became the personal treasurers of the Crown of France. For roughly a century, the royal treasury of France was physically kept and managed inside the Paris Temple by the Templars themselves. I want you to hold on to that fact. The richest, most secure, most untouchable financial institution in Christendom, and its single biggest client, was the King of France. Remember that, because it's about to become the most important detail in the whole story. By the year 1300, the Templars looked like the safest thing in the world. Tax-exempt, law-exempt, papally protected. Bankers to kings, unassailable. The height, the peak, the moment of maximum shine. And you already know, don't you, from the 2 stories before this one, exactly what a moment of maximum shine tends to be. The trouble did not come from the Templars. It came, as it did with the Templars' own royal client, from the client's balance sheet. The King of France at this time was Philip IV. Philip the Fair, they called him for his looks, not his conduct. And Philip had a problem that will sound familiar by now. He was broke. He had bankrupted himself, waging expensive wars against England and against Flanders. He had already expelled and robbed the Jews and the Lombard bankers to seize their wealth. And he was deeply, enormously in debt to the Templars. In 1299 alone, they had loaned him 500,000 livres. So Philip faced a choice. He could repay a colossal debt to the most powerful order in Europe, or he could make the order and the debt disappear. He chose to make it disappear. And the method he chose is one of the coldest acts of statecraft in medieval history. Rather than pay, Philip and a weak, pliable pope, Clement V, who owed his position largely to French influence, manufactured a scandal out of nothing. They accused the Templars of heresy, of blasphemy, idolatry, secret obscene rituals, spitting on the cross. None of it was true, but truth was never the point. The point was to build, out of pure invention, a crisis of legitimacy severe enough to justify destroying them. And then Philip did the thing that only his particular access made possible. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, in a single coordinated dawn, every Templar in France was arrested at once. In one morning, across an entire kingdom. Consider how much planning that required. To seize an entire class of the wealthiest, best defended men in Europe simultaneously, before any of them could flee or warn the others. You would need to know exactly where every one of them was. And Philip did know, because his own royal clerks had worked for years inside the Templar treasury. He knew precisely how much they had, and precisely where every last preceptory stood, and precisely how to reach all of them on the same night. Here is the terrible irony at the center of it. The very network the Templars had built to make themselves secure, the web of houses, the meticulous records, the interconnected system, became the map their destroyer used to find every single one of them in a single morning. The thing they built to protect their power was the exact thing that let it be erased overnight. The fix, in the end, became the disease. That day, Friday the 13th, is very likely the origin of why that date has felt unlucky to Western minds for 700 years. The unluckiest day on the calendar may simply be a 700-year-old debt collection. What followed was grim and I'll carry it through its consequence rather than linger on it. The arrested knights, including the Grand Master, an old man named Jacques de Molay, were tortured. Under torture, they confessed to the invented crimes, as tortured men will confess to anything. Those coerced confessions became the proof. In 1312, Pope Clement dissolved the order. And here is a detail that ought to chill you. In the very document that dissolved them, a bull called Vox in Excelso, the Pope admitted there was not sufficient legal cause to actually condemn the order. He suppressed them anyway, not because they were guilty, but because the scandal had grown too large, and it was, in his words, for the common good. The order's assets were nominally handed to another order, the Hospitallers, but Philip extracted an enormous compensation payment first and simply kept the French lands. His debt was gone. In its place, a fortune. In 1314, Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake on a small island in the Seine after publicly recanting his confession and declaring the order innocent to the end. And now the final, quietest horror. In the year 2001, nearly 7 centuries later, a historian found a document misfiled in the Vatican's own archives. It's called the Chinon parchment. And what it proves is that in 1308, Pope Clement had privately absolved de Molay and the other leaders of the charge of heresy. He knew they were innocent. He cleared them in secret, in writing, and then dissolved and destroyed them anyway to keep the peace with a king who owed them money. The proof of their innocence existed the entire time. It just sat in a drawer for 693 years. 3 stories now. A financier, a company, a holy order. Paper, ships, and faith. And each one, at the very moment it looked most invincible from the outside, had already begun, invisibly, from within, to die. You've felt the shape 3 times now. It's time I gave it a name. Stop for a moment and look back at what you've just watched. John Law at 1900%. The VOC, its shares at 1200% of value. The Templars, the richest and most untouchable institution in all of Christendom. 3 completely different things. A man, a corporation, an order of monks, separated by centuries and by every other circumstance you can imagine. And not one of them fell at its weakest moment. Every single one of them fell after its strongest one. That's the thing I've been circling this whole time. And now I'll say it plainly, because you've earned it. You've seen it happen 3 times with your own eyes. There are 7 stages. I've watched them repeat across every collapse I've ever studied, and they come, as far as I can tell, always in the same order. Let me name them for you, just once, so you have the words. First, the Hungry Founding. A small, desperate group solves a problem no one else can, and learns it can take far more than it needs. Second, the Machine of Conquest. The improvising founders are replaced by institutions, by administrators, by a system that runs itself. Third, the Golden Plateau, the richest, shiniest, most unstoppable-looking moment of all. Fourth, the quiet defection of the elite. The people who run the thing stop believing they owe it anything. Fifth, the bill comes due. The commitments outrun the money, and every attempt to fix it makes it worse. Sixth, the cracking of the center, the internal fractures split open right as an outside pressure arrives. And seventh, the long dark. The thing outlives its own ability to function, kept upright by spectacle and debt, until some ordinary shock it once could have shrugged off finally finishes it. 7 stages, same order, wildly different clocks, 18 months or 400 years. Now, I told you at the start this isn't a law of physics, and I meant it. It's a pattern I've traced, not a prophecy I can prove, but I'll tell you the single most important thing I think I've learned from tracing it. And it's this. The peak is not the summit. The peak is the pivot. The moment an empire looks most unstoppable from the outside is, almost without exception, the moment the rod begins on the inside. And do you want to know why? Because that is precisely the moment the people who run it stop believing they owe it anything. When you are winning that completely, the rules start to feel like they're for other people. That's stage 4, the quiet defection. And it is the hinge on which every single one of these stories turns. So from here on, I want you to watch for it. Watch the shine, and then watch very closely for the moment someone at the top quietly stops paying in, stops paying their taxes, stops sending their sons to the army, stops believing the whole thing is theirs to hold up. That's the tell. That's the exact symptom an insider could have caught if they'd known to look. And once you've seen it a few more times, I suspect you'll start spotting it a beat before I even say it. Let's keep going. But now you have the words, and it changes everything about what you're about to see. Philip destroyed the Templars to escape a debt, but an empire can also be destroyed by the people it forced to pay, the ones it bled year after year, while it looked strongest. To see that, we cross an ocean, and we go to a city built on water. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec, more properly the Mexica Empire, rising out of a lake in the Valley of Mexico like something dreamed rather than built. Causeways stretched across the water to the shore, canals threaded between the buildings. Aqueducts carried fresh water to a population that may have numbered 200,000 souls, in a city larger and cleaner than almost anything in Europe at the same moment. When the Spanish first saw it, some of them wondered aloud whether they were dreaming. The empire behind it was young, and it was hungry, and it was ferociously strong. It had been founded in 1428 when 3 cities on the lake, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, bound themselves into what we call the Triple Alliance, threw off their former overlords, and began to expand. By the reign of Moctezuma II in the early 1500s, they ruled millions of people across central Mexico. But here's the crucial thing about how they ruled. The Aztec Empire ran on tribute. It did not so much govern its conquered peoples as extract from them, demanding goods, labor, and something far more terrible: human beings for sacrifice. Neighboring peoples were required to send victims, and to keep a steady supply, the empire fought a particular kind of ritualized combat, the so-called Flower Wars, against nearby city-states, chief among them a stubborn, proud people to the east called the Tlaxcalans. Think about what that does over decades. Generation after generation, the Tlaxcalans watched their sons and daughters marched off to die on Aztec altars. They were surrounded. They were bled. And they hated Tenochtitlan with a patience and a depth that only that kind of sustained cruelty can produce. Now, from the outside, from the top of the great temple, looking out over the lake, this all looked like strength. Enemies kept weak, tribute flowing in, the machine working exactly as designed. But watch closely. Because the empire's genius for keeping its neighbors weak and afraid was the entire time quietly assembling the one thing that could destroy it: an army of people who wanted it dead. The empire looked most secure at the very moment its foundations were made of people praying for its fall. In 1519, a Spanish expedition under Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast. It was small, a few hundred men. Against an empire of millions, it should have been nothing. And it would have been nothing if the empire had been what it appeared to be. But Cortés did the one thing that turned a doomed adventure into a conquest. He found the resentment, and he lit it. After some early fighting, the Tlaxcalans made a cold, clear-eyed calculation. These strangers, whatever they were enemies of Tenochtitlan. And the enemy of my enemy might, at long last, be the lever that ends a century of misery. So, Tlaxcala allied with the Spanish. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the popular story gets it almost exactly backwards. The army that would eventually bring down the Aztec Empire was not, in any meaningful sense, a Spanish army. It was overwhelmingly indigenous, tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other allied warriors, with a small European core threaded through it. The Aztec Empire was not conquered by Spain. It was torn apart by its own subjects, who finally had somewhere to turn. Cortés marched inland with this growing coalition and entered Tenochtitlan, and through a sequence of maneuvers, hostage-taking, and treachery, soon held the Emperor Moctezuma captive inside his own palace, in his own capital. Picture that. The most powerful man in the Americas, a prisoner in the heart of his own city. The walls around him no longer quite his. Then it fractured completely. While Cortés was away, his deputy ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles gathered for a religious festival, and the city rose in fury. In the chaos of the uprising, Moctezuma was killed. The exact circumstances are still argued over, and I won't pretend to settle them. The Spanish and their allies fought their way out of the city on a night of catastrophic losses that history remembers as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The empire had survived, wounded, but standing. A new emperor, Cuitlahuac, took the throne and began urgently to organize the resistance. And for a moment, it might genuinely have held. But the finisher was already in the city, and it had not come with an army. An earlier Spanish expedition had carried, among its men, an infected member, someone carrying smallpox, a disease the peoples of the Americas had never encountered and had no defense against whatsoever. From that single source, the virus spread inland and reached Tenochtitlan in the autumn of 1520. What followed? I'll carry through its consequence, because the human detail is almost too heavy to dwell on. The city was devastated. Estimates of the dead range from roughly a third to nearly half of the population in a matter of months. Across the wider region, the toll over that whole wave is counted, by some scholars, in the millions. And the disease did something armies rarely manage. It decapitated the leadership at the worst possible instant. The Emperor Cuitlahuac, the man who had rallied the empire, the one competent hand on the wheel, died of smallpox in December of 1520. He had reigned for roughly 80 days. There it is again, the tell, in a form crueler than any of the others we'll see. An empire that had spent a century making enemies of everyone within reach, so that when the crisis came and it needed the loyalty of its neighbors, there was none to be had. Only the waiting army it had built out of grief. The last emperor, a young man named Cuauhtemoc, defended a dying city. Cortes returned with an enormous indigenous coalition, controlled the lake with ships, cut the causeways, and severed the aqueduct. No food, no fresh water. The siege lasted from May to August of 1521, and on the 13th of August, Tenochtitlan fell, and an empire of millions ended in a little over 2 years. Not because a few hundred Spaniards were invincible, but because the empire, at its strongest, had already manufactured everything needed for its own destruction. The shock from outside, the disease, the strangers, only lit a fire that the empire itself had spent 100 years stacking. The Aztecs were undone by the neighbors they had bled. Our next story is about an empire that was, by legend, the richest the world has ever seen, undone by the one thing that all its gold could not buy, a peaceful way to choose the next king. There is a number you may have seen, $400 billion. Sometimes it's attached to a name, Mansa Musa, with the claim that he was the richest human being who has ever lived. I want to start here by taking that number away from you, gently but completely. Because the historians who actually study this man are quite clear. His wealth cannot be converted into modern dollars at all. The 400 billion figure comes from nowhere serious. It's a myth. And what's strange, what's telling, is that the myth is the part everyone remembers, while the thing that actually destroyed his empire is a story almost no one ever tells. So let's tell it properly. In the 14th century, the West African Empire of Mali sat astride the trans-Saharan trade routes, controlling a staggering share of the world's known gold. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, became a legend in his own lifetime, largely because of a single journey. In 1324, he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he crossed the desert with a caravan so laden with gold that the stories of it echoed across 3 continents. The chroniclers can't even agree on the size of it. One says 60,000 men, another says 8,000, which tells you these were impressions, not inventories. When he passed through Cairo and spent freely, he was later said to have depressed the price of gold there for years afterward. Even that is probably overstated. The real effect was a temporary dip, not a broken economy. But the impression lingered, the richest man anyone had ever seen. Then Mansa Musa died in 1337. And here begins the part that matters. Mali had no settled, unquestioned way to pass power from one ruler to the next. And so, after Musa, it began, slowly over generations, to come apart. Weak successors, raiders picking at the edges, and its own vassals asserting their independence one by one. Among those breakaway vassals was a rising power on the Niger River that would, in time, eclipse Mali entirely. Its name was Songhai. Songhai is the empire history forgot, and it shouldn't have. Built by a conqueror named Soni Ali, and then consolidated by a brilliant administrator, Askia Muhammad I, it became the largest empire in the history of West Africa, larger by land than Mali had ever been. Its cities, Timbuktu and Djenné and Gao, were centers of trade and Islamic scholarship famous across the Muslim world. The libraries of Timbuktu, the university at Sankore, this was a civilization at a genuine height. The height, remember, you know what the height means by now. Because Songhai carried Mali's one fatal inheritance. It, too, had no reliable way to answer the question every empire must eventually answer: who rules next? And after its great administrator's reign ended, and especially after 1586, the throne of Songhai became a prize fought over in a rapid, vicious sequence of succession wars and palace coups. Ruler after ruler, conspiracy after conspiracy, until a man named Askia Ishak II came to power in 1588 on a throne that looked from the outside still vast and rich and formidable, and was, on the inside, hollow, fractured, exhausted by its own infighting. You know the symptom by now. The empire looked enormous, but the people at the top had spent years fighting each other for the crown instead of holding the thing together. And the rod at the center, invisible across the desert, was about to be reported to exactly the wrong person. Far to the north, in Morocco, the Saadi Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur had long-eyed Songhai's goldfields. What he lacked was certainty about whether he could take them. Then the story goes, a royal captive escaped from a remote Songhai salt mine and made his way to Morocco and told the Sultan the truth, that the great Southern Empire was divided against itself, that its throne was weak, that the moment was now. So al-Mansur gambled. He sent an expedition south across the Sahara, a small force, only a few thousand men. But this force carried something Songhai had almost no experience of: gunpowder, arquebuses, light cannon. And its makeup was itself a curiosity of history. Its commander, a man called Judar Pasha, and a great part of its infantry were not Moroccan at all, but European converts and renegades, many of them refugees from the fall of Muslim Spain, from Granada, now marching under an African sultan's banner with the newest weapons in the world. The crossing was brutal. The desert took a savage toll. By the time they reached the Niger, the expedition had reportedly lost something like half its strength just to the sand and the sun. They arrived exhausted, depleted, and vastly outnumbered, for the Songhai army that came out to meet them was many times their size. It should not have been close, and it wasn't. At the Battle of Tondibi in March of 1591, the two forces met. The Songhai commanders had a plan: drive a great herd of cattle at the Moroccan line and break it apart in the stampede. But gunpowder is a thing you cannot plan around if you have never faced it. The volleys of gunfire panicked the cattle, and the terrified herd wheeled and stampeded back into the Songhai ranks. So the arquebuses and cannon did their work on massed men who had no answer to them at all. In roughly 2 hours, the largest empire in West African history broke. 2 hours against a force that had already lost half itself to the desert. Askia Ishaq's authority collapsed almost immediately. He was killed soon after. Judar Pasha's men sacked Gao and Timbuktu and Jenne, and much of the scholarly treasure of Sankore was scattered or destroyed. A remnant of Songhai survived in a distant region for generations, but the empire, the real one, was finished. And the great trans-Saharan trade that had made it rich began in the years that followed to wither as the world's commerce shifted to the Atlantic coast and left the desert routes behind. Centuries of splendor undone in an afternoon by a technology the empire had no answer to, striking a throne that had already torn itself apart. History kept the gold and Mansa Musa's caravan and the 400 billion myth. It forgot the succession crisis that actually did the killing. Songhai fell in an afternoon because its throne had just shattered from within. Now travel east and back more than 1,000 years to the empire that wrote the original version of that exact story. Corrupt insiders, a furious people, and warlords at the gate. And while we're here, I'm genuinely curious. If this pattern is real, then it's hiding everywhere. In empires, yes, but also in companies, in institutions, in things you'd never think to name. So tell me, down in the comments, what power do you suspect secretly followed these same 7 stages? I read them, and the best ones become episodes of their own. The empire we're going to now was in its day one of only 2 true superpowers on the planet. The other was Rome. We'll get there. This is the Han Dynasty of China. And by any measure, it was a marvel. Its people invented paper. It built the civil service examination. The radical idea that the men who run a state should be chosen by merit, by testing, rather than by birth. It ran the eastern half of the Silk Road, and its reach and sophistication rivaled anything the ancient world produced. For 4 centuries, it was the definition of a golden age. And it was eaten slowly from the inside of its own palace until there was almost nothing left. The rot did not begin in a throne room, though. It began in the fields. By the 2nd century of the empire, a quiet crisis had been building beneath all that prosperity. Land was concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, and ordinary peasant farmers falling into debt were being forced off their own land and into tenancy, working ground they no longer owned, and surrendering 1/3, sometimes half, of everything they grew to wealthy landlords. On top of that came the state's own taxes. So, from the outside, a golden age, the envy of the world. From below, among the people who actually fed the empire, a slow, grinding trap, tightening year by year. Hold that image of the countryside quietly filling with desperation. Because now we go inside the palace, where the 2nd half of the disease was taking hold. Under an emperor named Ling, in the latter half of the 2nd century, real power had drained away from the emperor himself and pooled in the hands of a faction of court eunuchs, a group history remembers as the 10 Attendants, though there were in fact 12. These were the men who controlled access to the emperor, who whispered in his ear, who stood between the throne and the vast bureaucracy that actually ran the country. And they used that position for one thing above all: to enrich themselves. They sold offices, they took bribes, they turned the machinery of the state, the most sophisticated administrative system on earth, into a private instrument for their own wealth. Here is a bitter little irony to sit with. The dynasty that had invented government by examination, government by merit, was, by the end, effectively governed by a clique of palace insiders who had passed no examination at all. The people closest to power had stopped serving it. They were feeding on it. And that, the men at the very top, quietly deciding the empire was theirs to strip rather than theirs to hold, is a shape you've seen in every story so far. The quiet defection playing out in the corridors of a palace. The countryside felt it. even if it couldn't name it. And in 184, the desperation below finally answered the corruption above. It came as a religious movement, a faith-healing sect promising a coming age of great peace, its followers binding their heads with yellow cloth. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, an enormous millenarian peasant uprising that swept across the empire like a fever. It was, in a real sense, one of history's first mass religious revolts. And though the Han state eventually put it down, it took years, and it shattered something that could not be repaired: the illusion that the center was still in control. To crush the rebellion, the throne had to hand real military power to regional commanders. And once those men had armies, the empire's fate no longer belonged to the emperor at all. It belonged to them. When Emperor Ling died in 189, the whole thing came apart with terrible speed. A struggle erupted between the imperial generals and the eunuch faction. A general named Hejin was lured into the palace and assassinated by the eunuchs. In retaliation, his allies stormed the palace and slaughtered the eunuchs in their turn. Thousands of them, in a single convulsion of violence that emptied the court of the very men who had hollowed it out. But it was far too late. The center was gone. Into that vacuum stepped a warlord named Dong Zhuo. He seized the capital, Luoyang. He installed a child on the throne as a puppet, and then, in 190, facing a coalition of rivals, he did something that stands as one of the great acts of desecration in Chinese history. He burned Luoyang, one of the greatest cities in the world, to the ground. He looted the tombs of the dead Han emperors for their treasure, and he dragged the court hundreds of miles west to a new capital. The chroniclers wrote that the devastation was so total that for 100 miles around, not a chicken or a dog remained alive. Rhetoric, surely, but rhetoric reaching for a real horror. After that, the dynasty was a ghost. The emperor, a figurehead, passed between warlords for another 30 years, while the generals carved China into pieces and fought one another for the whole. Until, in the year 220, a warlord's son, named Cao Pi, finally forced the last Han emperor to abdicate. Quietly, on paper, a formality closing out a death that had happened decades before. China split into 3 kingdoms. And here is a strange, almost gentle afterlife. That precise collapse, the corrupt court, the weak emperor, the peasant fury, the warlords tearing the country apart, became, centuries later, the raw material for one of the best-loved novels in all of human literature, The Romance of the 3 Kingdoms. The Han fell exactly along the 7-stage arc, and its fall was so dramatic in its human detail that a civilization turned it into its favorite story. The Han shows you the pattern in its ancient, complete form. Prosperity, then rot at the top, then fury from below, then warlords, then the quiet paper ending. Now watch what happens when an empire takes that same arc and stretches it, impossibly, across 400 years. The longest, slowest death in all of history. Every empire we've seen so far died relatively quickly. John Law in 18 months. Songhai in an afternoon. Even Rome, when we return to it, will feel sudden compared to this. Because this empire refused to die for 250 years. It was betrayed, sacked, bled, shrunk to almost nothing, and it kept standing, out of nothing but its own walls and its own stubborn dignity, long after every reason to still be alive had gone. This is the Byzantine Empire, though it never called itself that. It called itself Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire, the surviving half, ruling from the greatest city in the Christian world, Constantinople. And to understand its long, aching fall, you have to begin at a genuine height. In the late 11th century, under a line of able emperors called the Komnenoi, Byzantium had rebuilt itself from an earlier near collapse into a wealthy, resurgent Mediterranean power. Its gold coin, the numisma, later the hyperpyron, was so trusted, so reliably pure, that it functioned as the reserve currency of the medieval world. The dollar of the Middle Ages, historians sometimes call it. When you wanted a coin you could trust from Italy to the edge of Persia, you wanted Byzantine gold. It had already survived its own near-death once. And that, I think, is precisely what made everyone, its enemies, its allies, and above all its own emperors, believe in their bones that it always would, that it was eternal, that whatever went wrong, the walls would hold and the empire would endure, as it always had. But watch the choices it made at that height, because they were reasonable. Every one of them solved a real, pressing problem, and every one of them mortgaged the future to do it. The first was money. To buy the naval support of the rising Italian city-state of Venice, and later Genoa and Pisa, the emperors granted them something enormous, sweeping exemptions from the taxes and customs duties that everyone else paid to trade through Byzantine waters. In the moment, it made sense. Venice had ships, the empire needed ships. This was the price. But think about what it actually did. It handed the most lucrative commerce in the empire's own waters to foreigners who paid the treasury nothing for it. The empire's economy might recover, but its government would be permanently starved of the revenue that commerce should have produced. Every emergency deal solved this year's crisis by guaranteeing a worse one. The treasury was being slowly starved to death by its own rescues. That's the tell here, in perhaps its purest form, the fix that quietly becomes the disease. Alongside it ran the old temptation, debasing the currency, thinning the once inviolate gold coin to stretch it further, chipping away at the very trust that had made Byzantine gold worth anything at all. But then came 1204, and the betrayal at the heart of this whole story. The Fourth Crusade had set out, in theory, to fight for Christendom in the Holy Land. The Crusaders had contracted with Venice to ferry them east, and then discovered, on arrival, that they could not pay the enormous fee because far fewer of them had shown up than they'd budgeted for. They were in debt to Venice before they had sailed anywhere at all. So Venice, holding the debt, redirected them. First to sack a Christian city on the Adriatic, to work off part of the bill, and then, chasing a Byzantine exile's promise of gold, to turn the whole crusading army against Constantinople itself. In 1204, the greatest Christian city on earth was stormed and sacked, not by its Muslim rivals, not by any traditional enemy, by a Catholic crusading army that the Pope himself had launched, doing it, in the end, to collect on a shipping debt. It was the first time the city had fallen to a foreign force since its founding nearly 9 centuries earlier. Its treasures were looted, carried off to Venice and across Europe, and the empire simply broke apart into pieces, a Latin empire installed in the capital and Greek rump states clinging on at the edges. One of those rump states, the Empire of Nicaea, would eventually crawl back and retake Constantinople in 1261. But the thing they recovered was a shadow. The empire never truly recovered from being murdered by its own civilization. It was, from 1204 onward, a dying thing pretending otherwise. And oh, how it pretended. This is the long shrinkage, the drawn-out long dark that gives this chapter its name. Anatolia, the empire's old heartland, was lost piece by piece to rising Turkish principalities, among them an obscure little frontier state under a chief named Osman, whose descendants would take the name Ottoman. To fight the Turks, the desperate Byzantines hired a company of ferocious mercenaries from Catalonia, several thousand of them. And here I have to pause for the grimly comic centerpiece of Byzantine decline, because it is almost too perfect. They hired the Catalan company to save them. Then, distrusting their own hired sword, the Byzantines had the mercenary leader assassinated to avoid, among other things, paying him. The Catalans' response was 2 full years of vengeance, ravaging Byzantine territory across Thrace and Macedonia. And then, having devastated the empire that hired them, they simply seized an entire Byzantine duchy for themselves, the Duchy of Athens, and held it for the better part of 70 years. Hire mercenaries to save you from your enemies, assassinate the mercenary to dodge the bill, lose a province to the mercenaries for a lifetime. That is the physics of an empire in its long dark. And the city itself was emptying out. Constantinople, which had held perhaps 400,000 people at its height, dwindled to something like 40 or 50,000. And then the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century and killed close to half of even that remnant. By the end, the mighty capital of the Roman East was a scatter of villages inside walls, built for a metropolis, with fields and orchards growing in the empty spaces between them. It wasn't an empire anymore. It was a fortified city, keeping up appearances, and even the appearances were 1,000 years old. The end came in 1453. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, young and relentless, brought an army of 60 to 80,000 men against a defending garrison of perhaps 7,000. The old Theodosian walls of Constantinople had turned back every attacker for over 1,000 years. But Mehmed had something the walls had never faced: an enormous siege cannon, capable of throwing a stone ball more than a mile, battering the ancient stone faster than the defenders could repair it. And here is the final unbearable irony of the 1,000-year death. The engineer who designed that cannon, a man named Orban, had come to the Byzantines first. He had offered them the weapon, and they had turned him away because they could not afford to pay him. So he took his design to the Sultan instead. The empire was killed at the last by a gun it could have bought, wielded by a man it could have kept, if only it had still had the money. Which, of course, it hadn't had for 200 years. On the 29th of May, 1453, the walls were breached, and the last emperor died fighting somewhere in the chaos, and the Roman Empire, the real, continuous line of it, running all the way back to Augustus, finally, after 1,500 years, came to an end. Byzantium took 400 years to die and fell at the end to a cannon. Our next empire took barely 6 years to fall, and it fell not to a cannon or a siege or an army at all. It fell to a signature, and most of the people watching it happen had no idea until it was over that they were watching an empire die. Every empire so far has been, in a sense, far away from us. Ancient coins, medieval knights, conquistadors, sultans, easy to watch from a safe distance. This one is different. This one happened inside living memory. There are people watching right now who remember it on the evening news. And I think that's exactly why it's worth sitting with, because it's the one collapse you can almost feel the temperature of. The Soviet Union, formed in 1922 out of the wreckage of the Russian Civil War, and grown by the middle of the 20th century into one of the two great powers on Earth. 15 republics, roughly a sixth of the planet's land surface. A nuclear arsenal capable of ending the world. A rival, an equal to the United States in every arena that seemed to matter. Into the early 1980s, it looked permanent. It looked, to almost everyone inside it and out, like a fixed feature of the world. And on the books, quietly, it was already dying. Because behind the parades and the missiles, the Soviet economy was running on a kind of slow-motion insolvency it could not admit. By the early 1980s, hidden budget deficits are estimated to have reached something like 7 or 8% of the whole economy. The shelves in the shops were often empty, a chronic shortage of ordinary goods that was, in truth, a form of suppressed inflation. From the outside, a superpower. On the inside, in the ledgers, no one was allowed to read honestly, a state that could no longer quite pay for itself. Then came the pressures, one after another. The Soviet Union depended heavily on selling oil to the outside world for the hard currency it needed. And in the mid-1980s, the global price of oil collapsed, pulling away one of its few reliable lifelines. Now, historians argue about exactly how much weight to give the oil shock. It was one factor among several, not the whole story, and I don't want to oversell it. But it landed at the worst possible moment. There was also the war in Afghanistan, dragging on from 1979, costing billions a year, and quietly demolishing the myth of the invincible Red Army, the idea that Soviet power was simply unstoppable, an idea that turned out to be load-bearing. Then a reformer arrived. Mikhail Gorbachev, convinced the system could be saved if only it could be opened up and restructured. He gave the world two words that outlived him: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He meant them as medicine. They turned out to be a solvent. Because once you allow people to speak openly about the system's failures, you cannot control what they say next. Glasnost let decades of suppressed grievance, national, ethnic, political, rise to the surface all at once. Across the 15 republics, people began to say out loud what they had long thought in private. And the authority of the Communist Party, which had rested so heavily on the appearance that no alternative was even thinkable, began to dissolve the moment alternatives became speakable. Now, I have to stop here, because this is the one story in our whole collection that looks like it breaks the pattern. Everywhere else, the elite defected quietly. The Roman senators simply stopped paying. The VOC's officers rewrote the rules in silence. The rot, in every other case, was invisible until it wasn't. But here the old guard didn't slip quietly away at all. In August of 1991, a group of communist hardliners did the opposite of a quiet defection. They staged a coup. They seized Gorbachev, tried to roll back the reforms by force to save the Union with tanks. Loud, visible, the reverse of everything I've been describing. So, does the Soviet collapse break the rule? I don't think it does. And here's why. The coup was not the defection. The defection had already happened, years earlier, silently, exactly as the pattern predicts. The people who actually ran the Soviet system, the vast managerial class, the party officials, the men who controlled the factories and the ministries, had long since stopped believing in the thing they administered. They no longer thought they owed it anything. They were, many of them, already quietly positioning to enrich themselves from whatever came next. That defection was invisible for years. What glasnost did was not created. Glasnost simply made a years-old defection finally audible. The coup was just the moment the argument spilled into the street. The pattern held. It just argued back first and lost. The coup collapsed in 3 days. And when it did, it didn't save the center. It destroyed what little authority the center had left, and it made a hero of Gorbachev's rival, Boris Yeltsin. After that, the end came with a speed that still feels unreal. There was no siege, no final battle, no burning capital. On the 8th of December, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a hunting lodge in a forest and signed a document stating, in effect, that the Soviet Union no longer existed. 3 men. A signature. A little over 2 weeks later, on Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned, handed over the codes to the nuclear arsenal, and the red flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. On the 26th of December, 1991, the Soviet Union, the superpower that had touched every continent on Earth, formally ceased to exist. A power built to survive nuclear war ended with a fountain pen in a forest lodge. Not with a scream, with a signature. Does that ending remind you of anything? A vast power, hollow for years, finished by a piece of paperwork that merely made official a death that had already happened. We're nearly back to that room in Ravenna. But there's one more stop first. An empire that didn't die of a coup, or a cannon, or a plague. It died, slowly and precisely, of arithmetic. And its debts, remarkably, outlived it. The Soviet Union died of many things at once. This next empire died of one thing, patiently, over a century. Money. Or more precisely, the lack of it, and the borrowing that lack demanded. The Ottoman Empire. At its height, under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, it was one of the most powerful states on earth, spanning the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, North Africa, dominating the trade of the whole Eastern Mediterranean. A superpower of 3 continents. And, like Rome, like Byzantium, it was rich beyond easy reckoning. I want to tell its story through its finances, because that is where it truly died, long before any army delivered the final blow. And the story begins, as these stories so often do, with a decision made from a position of total strength that turned, over centuries, into a knife pointed at its own heart. At its peak, the Ottomans granted certain European trading nations, France first, in 1536, a set of special commercial privileges. They were called the capitulations. And when they were granted, they were an act of confidence. Europe was the junior partner. These were favors handed down by a dominant power to smaller ones, tools to secure alliances and encourage trade. From a position of strength, they cost nothing. But watch what a fixed privilege does when the balance of power slowly reverses. As the centuries passed and European economic and military might grew, those same capitulations curdled. Now they meant that European merchants could operate inside Ottoman borders, trading without paying Ottoman taxes, and largely outside the reach of Ottoman courts. The favor granted from strength had become, from weakness, a permanent hemorrhage. Foreign traders thriving tax-free inside your own empire, and no easy way to stop it. Every advantage the empire handed out at its peak became, a century later, a wound it could not close. And alongside that ran the oldest fiscal temptation of them all, the one we watched hollow out Rome and Byzantium, debasing the money. The Ottoman silver coin lost something like 90% of its real value across the 17th century. A later coin lost more than half its silver in a single decade. And when they tried paper money to cover the gaps, distrust of the unbacked notes triggered its own crisis. Every fix bought a little time and cost a little more trust. Then, in 1854, came the fatal step. To pay for the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire took out its first ever foreign loan. Its first. And once a state that has never borrowed abroad discovers how easy borrowing is, the habit is very hard to break. 14 more loan agreements followed over the next 20 years. And the money did not go into the kind of productive investment that might have paid the loans back. It went into railways, yes, but also into palaces, into court extravagance, into modernizing an army the treasury could not actually afford. They were borrowing, in effect, to keep up appearances, to look like a great power while the foundation beneath the appearance quietly rotted. You can already hear the arithmetic closing in, can't you? In 1873, a global financial panic struck. Floods and droughts wrecked the harvests of Anatolia, crushing tax revenue at the exact moment the debt payments were peaking. And the numbers became impossible. By 1875, the empire owed, very roughly, something on the order of £200 million, against an annual income of only around 20 million. Its debt was something like 8 to 10 times its entire yearly revenue. And fully 2/3 of every year's income was already being swallowed whole, just to pay the interest on what it had already borrowed. There is no way out of a hole like that. And in October of 1875, the Ottoman Empire admitted it. It defaulted, suspended its payments to its European creditors. A sovereign empire, telling the bankers of the world it could not pay. And now we reach the moment that gives this chapter its name. Because what the creditors did in response is, I think, one of the most quietly astonishing events in the history of money. In 1881, an arrangement was struck, and under it, the empire's European bondholders, the people it owed money to, were granted the right to collect Ottoman taxes directly, to reach into a sovereign empire and take a large share of its revenue at the source before it ever reached the Sultan's treasury. They set up an institution to do it, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. And this bureau, run largely by representatives of foreign creditors, grew and grew until, at its peak, it employed something like 9,000 people, more than the Ottoman government's own finance ministry. By the eve of the First World War, it was collecting roughly 1/3 of all the state's revenue on behalf of foreign lenders. Sit with the strangeness of that. A sovereign empire, 600 years old, whose tax collectors answered not to its own ruler but to European bondholders. On paper, it still had a sultan, a court, a flag, all the trappings of a great power. In practice, it had a receiver. It had been placed, gently and bureaucratically, into something very close to foreclosure. The same grim machine ran, at the same time, in Egypt, nominally an Ottoman province. There the ruler's debts exploded from a few £1 million to over 90 million in barely a decade, at interest rates that reached 25–27%. Egypt sold its shares in the Suez Canal to Britain to raise cash. And in 1882, Britain simply occupied the country outright. The same story: borrow at ruinous rates, then lose control of your own land to the people you owe, playing out twice, side by side. Once an empire has lost control of its own money, the loss of its land is only a formality being processed. And the territory did peel away, piece by piece. Tunisia, gone. Libya, gone. The Balkan Wars stripped away nearly all that remained in Europe. There is a phrase you may know for what the Ottoman Empire had become: the sick man of Europe. Its origins are a little murkier than the phrase suggests. What we know is that in 1853, The Russian Tsar Nicholas I privately described the empire to a British diplomat as a sick man, gravely ill. The fuller, famous branding came later, but the diagnosis stuck because it was true. A sick man, propped up in his chair, being quietly relieved of his possessions by his attendants. The political end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. The empire chose the losing side in the First World War, was defeated, and was carved up by the victors. And then, in a final twist, its own new National Assembly, the movement led by Mustafa Kemal, who would become Ataturk, abolished the Sultanate itself. On the 1st of November, 1922, the 600-year Ottoman monarchy was voted out of existence. The last sultan slipped away into exile on a British warship a couple of weeks later. No dramatic last stand, just a vote and a quiet departure. But here is the detail I want to leave you with, the one that proves this collection is not really about crowns and battles at all. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922. Its debts did not. Those 19th century loans, the ones that had reduced a superpower to a debtor with foreign tax collectors, were not fully paid off until 1954. 1954. A date worth sitting with on its own. The debt outlived the empire that created it by more than 3 decades, a full century, almost to the year, after that very first loan in 1854. The empire was mortal. The debt, it turned out, was very nearly immortal. The Ottomans died of arithmetic, and the arithmetic outlived them. But there is one last empire we have to visit. The one whose fall gave the world the very word fall. The one we have already seen the end of, in a quiet room in Ravenna, at the very beginning of all this. It's time to go back to that room. I told you it would look different the second time. Ravenna. Late summer, the year 476. The General Odoacer. The teenage emperor with the borrowed name. The pension. The regalia bundled up and shipped east. You remember it. You've been carrying it this whole time. When we stood in this room at the beginning, it was a mystery. A quiet, almost embarrassing ending to the mightiest empire the ancient world ever built, and no explanation for how something so vast could arrive at something so small. But you're not the same viewer who walked into this room the first time. You've now watched 9 empires die. You know the shape. You know the 7 stages. And you know the secret at the heart of them. So let me not simply tell you what happened to Rome. Let me do something else. Let me read it, the way a physician reads a body, and show you not just that it died, but exactly which stage did the killing and when. We'll move quickly through the stages you already know by heart. But there is one I'm going to slow down on, because it's the one that turns this whole video into a mirror. And before I do, if this pattern has stayed with you all the way to the last and longest story, do me one small kindness. Share this with the one person you know who'd see the world a little differently for having it. Leave a rating, so the show finds a few more night owls like you. And tell me, down in the comments. Which of the 10 hit you hardest? Then settle back in. We have a body to read. Rome's peak was the Pax Romana, the 2nd century, the Roman peace, the entire Mediterranean under one law, a professional army of some hundreds of thousands, a silver coin, the denarius, trusted across the known world. From the outside in that century, Rome looked more permanent than any power in human history. And you know now precisely what that kind of shine means. The rot began at the top of the ark. And the first rot was the one we've seen again and again, the money. This is stage 5, and it began decades, centuries, before any barbarian became a real threat. The denarius under Augustus was almost pure silver, 95% and more. But emperor after emperor, needing to pay for wars and grand gestures without the political pain of raising visible taxes, quietly thinned it, melted it down, mixed in base metal, restruck it. By the year 200, it was under 60% silver. By the reign of Caracalla, around half. And by the year 300, it held barely a trace of silver at all. A debasement of more than 90%, spread across 3 centuries, so slow that no single generation quite saw it happening. That is an invisible tax. Inflation working like rust. And it means something remarkable. Rome was already bankrupt in substance long before it was ever bankrupt in fact. The empire was broke centuries before a single barbarian crossed the border for good. It simply hadn't admitted it yet, much as a certain empire we just left wouldn't admit its own arithmetic, 1700 years later. Now, here is where I slow down, because this is the stage that matters most, and it's the one the world forgets when it tells the story of Rome as a tale of savage invaders at the gates. This is stage 4, the quiet defection of the elite. And in Rome, it is written more clearly than anywhere else in all of history. As the coin was being hollowed out, the wealthiest families of Rome, the great senatorial dynasties, the men with the villas and the estates and the vast inherited fortunes, were quietly making themselves immune from most taxation. They engrossed more and more of the empire's wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And, at the same time, they grew, in the words of the historians, divorced from any tradition of military service. They would not pay, and they would not fight. The richest citizens of Rome contributed the least, in either coin or blood, to the defense of the empire that made their fortunes possible, and they came to regard that exemption not as a scandal, but as their right. That's the whole thesis, in a single fact. The people the empire had enriched the most decided, quietly, that they no longer owed it anything. Not their money. Not their sons. Not their loyalty. The empire's own winners walked away from the duty of holding it up and told themselves they had earned the right to. No trumpet announced this. No battle marked it. It was the quietest thing imaginable, a slow, comfortable, entirely reasonable feeling withdrawal by the people who had the most to lose. And it was, in hindsight, the most fatal wound of all. Because an empire whose strongest members stop paying in is an empire being eaten from the inside, in perfect silence, while it still looks, from the outside, like the greatest power on earth. And once that defection had done its work, everything else followed like dominoes. The army, starved of money, had to be filled with foreigners, barbarian war bands, the foederati, hired to defend a frontier the empire's own citizens would no longer man, and carrying none of the old loyalty. Then the shocks came. In the year 378, at Adrianople, an emperor and a huge portion of an entire field army were annihilated by the Goths in a single afternoon. And rather than expel the Goths, a weakened Rome was forced to settle them inside its own borders, the first time such peoples were given a home within the empire, keeping their own leaders, their own cohesion, a nation lodged inside the nation. This is stage 6, the cracking of the center. And Rome's version of it is almost too bitter, because as the frontier dissolved, the Romans kept fighting each other. Civil war after civil war, emperors and usurpers stripping troops from the borders to fight rival Romans. At one point, the whole Rhine frontier was drained of its defenders to settle an internal quarrel, and Germanic peoples simply walked across and occupied the land, unopposed. Rome kept winning its civil wars, and every victory left the border a little more open. And then, stage 7, the long dark and the fiscal wound that sealed it. In the year 439, the Vandals took Carthage, and with it, the grain fields and tax base of North Africa, the breadbasket that fed the city and funded the army. It may have been the single most damaging blow of the entire decline, and it was not a lost battle. It was a lost balance sheet. The empire was now starving of money and of grain at the same time. Which brings us, at last, all the way back to this room. By 476, the Western emperor wielded almost no real power over anything. The office had been a hollow ceremony for years. So when Odoacer arrived, a Germanic general, come, as we said at the very beginning, not to conquer a city but to do a piece of paperwork, and retired the teenage Romulus Augustulus to his villa and sent the crown east, he was not toppling a mighty empire. He was signing the receipt on a death that had already, quietly, happened decades before. It was barely news, because there was almost nothing left to end. That is why it looked completely different the second time. The first time, it was a mystery. How could something so great end so small? Now you know. It ended small because it had been dying for 250 years, one debased coin and one defecting nobleman at a time, and the man in the room was only there to turn out the last light in a house that had been dark for a generation. The fall of Rome was never the fall. The fall was the 2.5 centuries no one was watching. The room in Ravenna was just the receipt. So, 10 empires. A Scottish financier who owned France for a year. A company with its own army and navy. An order of warrior monks who thought they answered only to God. An empire on a lake, undone by the neighbors it had bled. 2 African empires and the succession crisis history forgot. A Chinese dynasty eaten from inside its own palace. A 1,000-year Roman survivor that finally fell to a cannon. A nuclear superpower that died of paperwork in a forest. A three-continent empire foreclosed on by its own creditors. And Rome, the one that named the very idea of falling. 10 completely different things, separated by continents, by centuries, by language and faith and the color of their crowns. And every single one of them walked the same 7 stages in the same order. The hungry founding, the machine of conquest, the golden plateau, the quiet defection of the elite, the bill comes due, the cracking of the center, and the long dark. In 18 months, or in 400 years, but never, not once, out of order. And now you know the secret that ties them together, because you've watched it prove itself 10 times. The peak was always the pivot. Not one of these powers fell at its weakest moment. Every one of them fell after its strongest, because the shine, the golden height, is exactly what convinces the people inside that the rules have stopped applying to them. That's why this was never really a video about empires. Strip away the crown, the flag, the army, and what's underneath is the real subject. Any concentration of power, a company, a bank, a family, a movement, a state that grows without any matching break on it will eventually generate its own decay, on whatever clock it happens to run. And there are 3 things I'd like to leave in your hands, quietly, as you drift off. The first, the shock from outside is almost never the real cause. The barbarian, the cannon, the invading force, that's only ever the finisher, arriving to knock over something already hollow. The second, the fix so often becomes the disease. The trade deal that starves the treasury. The banking network that maps you for arrest. The reform that lets the pressure out. And the third, the rot outlives its makers. The debt, the resentment, the quiet withdrawal, they linger on, long after the empire that bred them is gone. An Ottoman loan being paid off in 1954. A grievance passed down for generations. A drawer in the Vatican holding proof of innocence for 693 years. Which leaves only one question. And I'm not going to ask it the way you might expect. Every power alive on Earth right now is somewhere on these 7 stages. That much is simply true. And the people living inside a golden plateau never ever know that they're standing on the pivot, because if they could feel the floor tilting, it wouldn't be a golden plateau. That's the whole cruelty of it. The best year and the first year of the fall look identical from the inside. So I won't ask you which stage anything is in. I'll leave you with something quieter instead. If you truly knew the tell, if you could really see it, you wouldn't need me or anyone to tell you which stage you were standing in. You'd already know. The people who lived through the quiet defection always knew something was wrong. They felt it in the coin that bought a little less each year, in the powerful who quietly stopped paying their share. They just didn't have a name for it yet. Now you do. If you were to press me, as I like to do at the end of these, for the single one that best illustrates the whole of it, I'd give you Rome. Not because it was the grandest, though it was, but because of the very thing that made it feel, at the start, like such an anticlimax. Rome's fall was so undramatic, so quiet, so easy to miss, that the world spent 1,500 years misremembering why it happened, blaming the barbarians at the gate instead of the noblemen who quietly stopped paying their taxes. The empire that gave us the very word fall is the one that proves the fall is never the moment we point to. It's the long, silent slope no one bothered to watch. Though, I'll admit, the case for the little French paper empire is hard to dismiss. The whole 7 stages, start to finish, in a single year. The same truth, exactly. Just played at speed, where you could finally see it move. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, Midnight Magnates. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.